April 9th, 2026. 4:47 a.m. local time. The Indian Ocean, 600 nautical miles south-southwest of the Maldives. The sea is black. No moon. A long, low swell rolls east to west across open water that hasn't seen a warship in weeks. And then, from out of the dark, a shape. The MV Shahid Rajai, an Iranian-flagged tanker displacing 115,000 deadweight tons, is running south at 11 knots. Navigation lights off. AIS transponder disabled. The ship is trying to be invisible. It isn't working, because 22 nautical miles to the northeast, the guided missile destroyer USS Stockdale is tracking every move. SPY-1D radar painting the tanker's hull every 2.4 seconds. Passive electronic surveillance intercepting encrypted satellite uplinks from the tanker's bridge to a shore station in Bandar Abbas. And 38,000 feet above the water, a P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft out of Diego Garcia is beaming synthetic aperture radar imagery to 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain in real time. The Shahid Rajai thinks it's alone. It has been alone for 5 days, crossing the Arabian Sea, slipping past Oman, cutting south through open water to avoid every known patrol corridor. What the crew doesn't know: the Stockdale picked them up 72 hours ago. The Poseidon has been overhead for 48, and in Bahrain, at Naval Forces Central Command, the order has already been drafted. Board the vessel, seize the cargo, enforce the sanctions. What followed over the next 6 hours exposed a shift in American naval strategy that Tehran never anticipated and had no answer to. I'm your host at Navy Powerline, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. This is the story of how the U.S. Navy moved its enforcement perimeter 2,400 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz and left Iran with nowhere to go. To understand why the Shahid Rajai was running dark through the Indian Ocean in April 2026, you need to understand what changed in January. On January 14, 2026, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control expanded secondary sanctions targeting Iranian crude exports to China. The new framework didn't just sanction buyers, it sanctioned intermediary shippers, refinery operators, insurance underwriters, and port authorities that facilitated delivery. The economic noose tightened overnight. Tehran's response was predictable. They rerouted. Instead of running tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, where 5th Fleet patrols monitored every vessel, Iranian oil moved south, down the coast of Oman, across the Arabian Sea, and into the deep Indian Ocean where no U.S. surface combatant had conducted sanctions enforcement in over a decade. For 2 months, it worked. Satellite imagery, later reviewed by NavCent Intelligence, showed at least 9 Iranian-flagged or Iranian-chartered tankers making the southern route between February and early April. The crude went to Chinese ports, Zhoushan, Rizhao, Dongying, through shell companies registered in the UAE and Malaysia. CENTCOM noticed. The National Maritime Intelligence Integration Office flagged the pattern in a classified brief on February 28th. By March 10th, the Pentagon had a plan. They called it Operation Trident Reach. The concept was simple but unprecedented. Instead of playing defense at the chokepoints where Iran's IRGC Navy held a tactical edge, the narrow waters of Hormuz, the congested shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf, the U.S. would project enforcement power into deep blue water. The open Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from Iranian shores, Iranian missiles, Iranian fast attack boats, and Iranian minefields. Out there, the U.S. Navy owns the ocean, and everyone in the Pentagon knew it. The Stockdale was the first piece. An Arleigh Burke-class Flight II, a guided missile destroyer, hull number DDG-106. Displacement, 9,700 tons. Crew, 329. armed with 96 vertical launch cells carrying a mixed loadout of SM-2, SM-6, and Tomahawk cruise missiles. The ship had been operating with Carrier Strike Group 3 in the Arabian Sea when it received new orders on April 3rd. Detach from the strike group, proceed south, locate and shadow a vessel of interest designated Target Sierra 7. Sierra 7 was the Shahid Raja'i. The destroyer found the tanker on April 6th, approximately 400 nautical miles east of Socotra Island. The Poseidon confirmed visual identification the following morning. Hull markings matched, draft consistent with a fully loaded crude carrier, and infrared signatures from the cargo tanks indicated the vessel was carrying approximately 1.8 million barrels of heavy crude. For 3 days, the Stockdale shadowed, silent. No radar emissions the tanker could detect. The destroyer used passive sensors and the Poseidon's feed to maintain track. The tanker's crew had no idea. But something almost derailed the operation before it started. On April 7th, the Stockdale's SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite detected an unexpected radar emission bearing southwest, a surface search radar consistent with an Indian Navy patrol vessel. The Indian frigate was conducting routine patrol operations along its extended economic zone. If the Indian ship closed within visual range and reported a U.S. destroyer shadowing an Iranian tanker in international waters, the diplomatic window would narrow fast. The Stockdale's commanding officer, Commander David Hurley, made a judgment call. He pulled the destroyer back to 35 nautical miles, beyond visual and radar horizon of the Indian frigate, and relied exclusively on the Poseidon overhead to maintain track on the Shahid Raja'i. For 11 hours, the only eyes on the target were at 38,000 feet. It worked. The Indian vessel turned north. The Stockdale closed the distance again after dark. I spent hours going through the unclassified portions of the 5th Fleet operational summary on this, and one detail keeps coming back to me. Hurley had less than 4 minutes to make that call. 4 minutes to decide whether to risk the entire operation or pull back and hope the Poseidon could hold the track alone. The fact that it worked doesn't mean it wasn't a gamble. On April 8th, the second piece moved into position. The amphibious transport dock USS Somerset, LPD-25, a San Antonio-class ship displacing 25,300 tons, had been operating with an amphibious ready group near the Seychelles. The Somerset carried a Marine Expeditionary Unit detachment. But more critically, it carried the visit, board, search, and seizure team that would execute the actual boarding. VBSS teams are not regular sailors. These are specialists trained in hostile ship takedowns, close-quarters combat in confined maritime spaces, evidence collection under operational conditions, and the legal protocols required to conduct a lawful seizure under international maritime law. The Somerset's team consisted of 24 operators, supported by 2 MH-60S Seahawk helicopters and 4 rigid-hull inflatable boats. By the evening of April 8th, both ships were in position. The Stockdale, 22 miles northeast, the Somerset, 40 miles south, the Shahid Raja'i, running dark between them, still broadcasting nothing. At 11:30 p.m. on April 8th, NavCent transmitted the execute order. Timing mattered. The boarding was set for dawn, 4:50 a.m., local time on April 9th. First light gives the boarding team maximum visibility while the tanker's crew is at its most fatigued. Standard operating procedure, refined through hundreds of boardings in the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea over the past 2 decades. At 4:47 a.m., the Stockdale went active. The destroyer's SPY-1D radar, the same system designed to track supersonic anti-ship missiles, lit up the tanker's hull at full power. Simultaneously, the Stockdale broadcast on Channel 16, the International Maritime Distress and Hailing Frequency. Motor vessel bearing 215. This is United States warship on your port quarter. You are suspected of transporting sanctioned cargo in violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions and United States executive orders. Reduce speed and prepare to be boarded. Acknowledge. Silence from the tanker. If you like military operations broken down with this level of detail, hit subscribe now. Because what happens next is where training meets reality. The bridge log of the Shahid Rajai, later recovered and reviewed by NavCent Intelligence, showed that the officer of the watch detected the Stockdale's radar at 4:47 and immediately woke the captain, a man identified in operational reports only as Captain Hosseini. Hosseini reached the bridge at 4:51. His first order, increase speed to maximum. It was futile. The Shahid Rajai's service speed was 14.5 knots. Maximum, running the engines beyond safe limits, might push 16. The Stockdale could make 31 knots without breaking a sweat. Hosseini's second order was smarter. He attempted to contact Tehran via satellite link. The call went to the IRGC Navy's Coordination Center in Bandar Abbas. The message, intercepted by the Stockdale's signals intelligence team, was frantic. American warship demanding we stop. Request instructions. What do we do? The response from Bandar Abbas came at 5:03 a.m. Do not comply. Maintain course. We are sending help. That response would prove to be the most expensive bluff in Iranian naval history. At 5:10 a.m., the Somerset launched. 2 MH-60S Seahawks lifted off the flight deck, each carrying a 6-man VBSS assault element. 4 RHIBs hit the water simultaneously, carrying the remaining 12 operators plus support personnel. The approach was coordinated. Helicopters from the east, boats from the south, the Stockdale closing from the northeast. The tanker had nowhere to go. At 5:22 a.m., the first Seahawk hovered over the Shahid Rajai's stern deck. Fast rope deployment. 6 operators on deck in under 40 seconds. The second helicopter put its team on the bow. Within 3 minutes, 12 armed U.S. Navy personnel controlled the exterior of the vessel. The RHIB teams reached the hull at 5:28. Boarding ladders deployed. The remaining operators scaled the sides and entered through the main deck access points. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Hosseini had been told not to comply. The IRGC Navy had promised reinforcements. Every protocol in the Iranian military playbook called for resistance, or, at minimum, delay. Lock the bridge, destroy documents, disable navigation equipment. None of that happened. According to after-action assessments, the tanker's crew of 28, a mix of Iranian and Filipino sailors, offered no resistance. The Filipino crew members stepped aside immediately. Several of the Iranian sailors did the same. Hosseini himself was found on the bridge, hands visible, standing next to a satellite phone that was still connected to Bandar Abbas. The call log showed he had been on the line for 17 minutes, receiving instructions from shore that had become increasingly contradictory. The VBSS team secured the bridge at 5:34 a.m. engine room by 5:41. Full control of the vessel by 5:58. Total boarding time, 36 minutes. Not a single shot fired. The bridge log told the story. Hosseini had been given explicit orders before departure. Avoid U.S. warships. If spotted, change course. If challenged, do not engage. Do not stop. But above all, do not be in a position where you can be boarded. Nobody in Tehran expected the Navy to operate this far south. The crew of the Shahid Rajai had been trained for encounters in the Persian Gulf, places where fast attack boats could swarm a boarding party, where shore-based anti-ship missiles could threaten a destroyer, where the narrow geography gave Iranian forces options. Out here, 2,400 nautical miles from Hormuz, there were no options. There was only the open ocean and the U.S. Navy. What strikes me about this operation is not the boarding itself. VBSS teams execute these routinely. It's the strategic logic behind moving the enforcement zone into deep water. CENTCOM didn't just seize a tanker, They demonstrated that Iran's entire sanctions evasion network rests on one assumption, that the U.S. Navy only enforces in the Gulf. Once that assumption collapsed, so did the strategy. Meanwhile, in Bandar Abbas, the IRGC Navy was scrambling. The help that Bandar Abbas had promised the Shahid Raja'i took the form of two Moudge-class frigates, the IRIS Jamaran and the Iris Damavand, Iran's most capable surface combatants. Displacement, 1,500 tons. Armed with Noor anti-ship missiles, an Iranian copy of the Chinese C-802, and a 76mm OTO Malara main gun. Maximum speed, 30 knots. On paper, not insignificant. The Moudge-class is a real warship with real weapons. But paper doesn't account for distance. The Shahid Raja'i was seized approximately 2,400 nautical miles south-southeast of Bandar Abbas. At maximum sustained speed, which the Moudge-class cannot actually maintain for extended transits, the frigates would need roughly 80 hours to reach the seizure zone, 3.5 days. The tanker would be long gone. Declassified reports later revealed that IRGC Navy Command realized this within the first 2 hours. The frigates sortied from Bandar Abbas at 7:15 a.m., but by 9:30 a.m., internal communications intercepted by U.S. signals intelligence showed a heated debate within the IRGC naval chain of command. The problem wasn't willpower, it was physics. The Moudge-class frigates have a maximum range of approximately 5,000 nautical miles at economical speed. A round trip to the seizure zone and back would consume nearly their entire fuel capacity, assuming they could even sustain the transit without mechanical issues. Iran's blue water logistics capability is effectively non-existent. No underway replenishment ships, no forward bases, no allied ports willing to refuel Iranian warships on a sanctions enforcement interception mission. One detail that stuck with me from the intercepted communications. At 10:14 a.m., a senior IRGC naval commander, identified in reports as Rear Admiral Tangsiri, reportedly asked his operations officer a single question: "Can we reach them before they reach Diego Garcia?" The answer was no. It wasn't even close. Here's the take that'll probably get us criticism. Iran's decision to sortie the frigates at all was theater. Tangsiri knew within 2 hours that the math didn't work. The frigates turned around less than 200 nautical miles from port. But the sortie had to happen. For domestic consumption. For the narrative of resistance. For the IRGC's internal politics. 2 frigates steaming south and then quietly returning home. Nobody in Tehran would publicize the turnaround. The U.S. Navy, of course, tracked every mile. Put yourself in Commander Hurley's position for a moment. You've just executed a textbook boarding in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Your VBSS team controls the tanker, no casualties. But you're still 2,400 miles from the nearest coalition port, and you know Iranian frigates have just sortied from Bandar Abbas. Your destroyer has 329 sailors, 96 missile cells, and the most advanced combat system in the world. But you're operating at the end of a very long logistics chain. The nearest carrier strike group is 4 days away. What would you have done? Hurley did exactly what the playbook called for. He formed a convoy. The Stockdale took position 2 miles ahead of the Shahid Raja'i. The Somerset fell in 2 miles astern. The Poseidon maintained overhead coverage, extending its patrol with aerial refueling from a KC-135 operating out of Diego Garcia. At 6:30 a.m. on April 9th, the convoy turned southwest. Destination: Diego Garcia, the joint U.S.-UK military facility in the Chagos Archipelago, approximately 900 nautical miles south-southeast. The transit would take 3 days at the tanker's speed. 3 days of open ocean with a seized Iranian vessel, an increasingly angry IRGC Navy, and the world's media starting to pick up the story. Tehran's public response came at 11 a.m. local time. approximately 6 hours after the boarding. Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kana'ani called the seizure an act of piracy on the high seas and demanded the immediate return of the vessel and its crew. The Iranian UN ambassador filed a formal protest with the Security Council by noon. State media ran continuous coverage, framing the operation as American aggression against Iranian commercial shipping. The U.S. response was measured. Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Patrick Ryder confirmed the boarding at a 2 p.m. press conference. U.S. naval forces conducted a lawful interdiction of a vessel suspected of transporting sanctioned Iranian crude oil in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions and U.S. executive orders. The operation was conducted safely and professionally. No injuries were reported. Behind the scenes, the diplomatic traffic was considerably more intense. Sources familiar with the operation described urgent back-channel communications between Washington and Beijing. The crude aboard the Shahid Rajai was bound for Zhoushan, a major Chinese refining hub. Beijing's response, relayed through diplomatic channels, was carefully calibrated. China expressed concern about the seizure, but notably did not demand the return of the cargo. The message was clear enough. Beijing was unwilling to escalate over a single shipment. The most surprising part of this operation isn't the boarding or the Iranian response. It's what happened in the insurance markets. Within 72 hours of the seizure, Lloyd's of London and the international group of P&I clubs issued revised risk assessments for Iranian-chartered vessels operating in the Indian Ocean. War risk premiums for any vessel suspected of carrying Iranian crude spiked by 400%. 3 major shipping companies quietly canceled charter agreements with Iranian intermediaries. 2 Malaysian shell companies that had been facilitating Iranian oil transfers went dark. Their offices in Kuala Lumpur vacated overnight. A single boarding did more to disrupt Iran's sanctions evasion network than 6 months of diplomatic pressure. The convoy reached Diego Garcia on April 12th. The Shahid Rajai was anchored in the outer harbor under U.S. military guard. Its crew was transferred to the Somerset for processing. The Iranian nationals were eventually repatriated through Oman, while the Filipino sailors were returned to Manila. The cargo, 1.8 million barrels of Iranian heavy crude, valued at approximately $140 million, remained aboard, subject to U.S. seizure proceedings. Most people assume the hardest part of an operation like this is the boarding itself. The evidence says otherwise. The hardest part was the 72 hours before, the shadowing, the intelligence coordination, the decision to pull back when the Indian frigate appeared. The boarding was the easy part. The strategic patience that made it possible was the real achievement. Iran's naval response continued to unfold in the days after the seizure, but it was largely symbolic. The Jamaran and Damavand returned to port within 18 hours of sortie. Iranian state media stopped covering their deployment entirely. On April 14th, the IRGC Navy announced a major exercise in the Strait of Hormuz. Fast attack boats swarming mock targets, shore-based missiles launched at floating targets. The message was aimed at a domestic audience. We are still powerful, we still control the strait. The problem, nobody in Washington was listening, because Washington had just demonstrated that the strait didn't matter anymore. The strategic implications of Operation Trident Reach extend well beyond a single tanker. For 2 decades, Iran's naval strategy has been built around what military analysts call anti-access/area denial, making the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz so dangerous and costly that no rational actor would risk a confrontation there. Fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles, shore-based cruise missile batteries, naval mines, suicide drones. The IRGC Navy has spent billions turning the Gulf into a kill zone where its asymmetric advantages neutralize American conventional superiority. Operation Trident Reach didn't defeat that strategy. It went around it. By moving enforcement operations into the open Indian Ocean, CENTCOM forced Iranian planners to confront a scenario they had never trained for, defending Iranian interests at intercontinental range, in deep water, with no shore-based support, no fast boat swarms, no minefields, and no geographic choke points to exploit. In that environment, the balance of forces is not close. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer outmatches Iran's entire surface fleet. Here's the question worth sitting with. Did Iran's naval leadership genuinely believe they could project power into the Indian Ocean to rescue the Shahid Rajai? Or did they know from the start that the sortie was for show? If you have a read on that, drop it in the comments. I've seen compelling arguments both ways. The operational pattern has continued since April 9th. According to commercial shipping tracking data, at least 2 more U.S. destroyers have been observed operating in the central and southern Indian Ocean, areas far from traditional Fifth Fleet patrol zones. The Poseidon flights out of Diego Garcia have increased from 2 per week to daily. The message to Tehran is clear. The old playbook is dead. Will Iran adapt? Almost certainly. The IRGC is resourceful and willing to take risks. They may shift to ship-to-ship transfers at sea, use vessels flagged under third-party states, or route tankers through entirely new corridors. The cat-and-mouse game is far from over, but the U.S. Navy has fundamentally changed the equation. The Persian Gulf was Iran's home court. The Indian Ocean is America's. Comment yes or no. Do you think Iran will attempt another southern route within 6 months, knowing what happened to the Shahid Rajai? The Shahid Rajai sits at anchor in Diego Garcia as of this recording. Its cargo remains under seizure. Its captain, Hosseini, was last reported in Oman, having declined to speak to Iranian state media. The bridge log, 137 pages of handwritten entries, is now in the possession of NavCent intelligence analysts. One entry, dated April 8th, the night before the boarding, reads simply, "No contacts on radar. See CENTCOM. Proceeding as planned." He had no idea the Stockdale was 22 miles away, matching his course and speed in total electronic silence. He had no idea the Poseidon was overhead, watching his ship through infrared cameras that could read the hull numbers from 7 miles up. He had no idea that the Somerset was closing from the south with 24 operators already briefing the boarding plan. The most powerful thing about the operation wasn't the missiles or the radar or the helicopters. It was the fact that Iran never saw it coming. Subscribe if you want to see how the U.S. Navy reshapes the rules of engagement across the world's oceans. Because this story isn't over. The Indian Ocean is 27 million square miles of open water, and somewhere out there tonight, another tanker is running dark. The question isn't whether the Navy will find it. The question is whether Tehran has learned anything at all.